I will do an introduction in English to welcome the speakers. Then the questions and the discussion will be made in Catalan, and they will benefit from the translation service. They will be answering in English, and that's how this session will unfold with a variety of languages. It's one of the nice things about sessions like these.
Francesca, I'm going to introduce you. It's a pleasure to have you here today.
Francesca was a commissioner for technology and digital innovation in Barcelona City Council in the previous term of office. It's a pleasure for us to have her here again.
Francesca Bria, you are the president of the Italian National Innovation Fund and a board member of the Italian Public Broadcast Company, la RAI, que és la Radio Televisió Italiana.
Italian Public Television.
You are also an honorary professor at the Institute of Innovation and Public Purpose in London. And you are also part of the roundtable for the new European Bauhaus, which is quite an important endeavor. So it's very, I'm going to ask you a specific question about this later when we have the conversation. You are also a former Chief Digital Technology and Innovation Officer at the City of Barcelona, as I said before. And also you were one of the founders of the City's Coalition for Digital Rights, which we have been, the Digital Coalition of Digital Rights has been here also during this event quite often. You also have a PhD on innovation and this is a hard word to say, a PhD in innovation for the Imperial College in London. And I also want to say one last thing, and that you are, according to the Forbes magazine, one of the top 50 women on the most influential people in the digital government, which is quite impressive. So congratulations. Thank you for being here. And Tony Navarro, who is going to speak today too, he is a philosopher specialized in feminist theories and in technology. You are currently researching conceptualization vector promoted by Technopolitics at the UOC, which is the Universitat Oberta de Catalunya, at the Canòdrom. We've talked about the Canòdrom before. And your main areas of interest are the political economy of geoengineering and the philosophy of artificial intelligence. And then we also have with us Fieke Jansen, and she is a postdoc researcher at the Data Justice Lab, and she is developing the Data Justice Project, and she looks at the effects of data and society. You also had a you also did a PhD, and then your research focused on the impact of implementing data driven this, made by European policy forces. You also worked at the Tactical Tech and talking about privacy and digital security programs. So it's quite a pleasure to have you all here. And this is what we're going to do. We're going to have a short presentation between like 10 and 15 minutes. I want you to explain us a little bit your field of expertise, and then I'm going to ask you some questions, and we're going to start a debate, and then we can have some questions by the audience. So, Francesca, if you want to start.
Okay. Thank you very much. Great to be here. A real pleasure. So maybe I keep this part a bit shorter, if you don't mind. I don't know. It seems maybe more important to dive into the conversation and the discussion. But anyways, I'm going to give you a taste of the many things I'm doing, but I think for the purpose of the conversation today, maybe I talk a bit more about my experience here as Comissionada de Tecnología e Innovación, and as Chief Technology and Digital Innovation Officer, and the work I've been doing both with the Decode project, which was one of the, let's say, pioneering projects that try to give back democratic control of data to citizens, let's say, moving away from surveillance capitalism or some of the problems of the extractive business model of digital platforms that I think we can discuss. And then I will also talk a bit more about how do we enforce digital rights principles, because I think we are, and I've seen you have done a great job in outlining some of these misura de governo and some of these internal code of conduct and regulation, and I think we are at a point where it will be great to see how those high-level principles really happen, how they become a reality, how they get implemented, how we can all, be part of this transformative thing. So, and then I think overall, just to say, I think I've been in this space for a bit too long. It felt like I'm getting a bit old in this digital culture space. When I was listening at your proposition about digital, let's say, digital public goods and digital commons, and how do we build infrastructures that allow us to, to distribute culture and wealth and to provide universal access, it felt like it's around 20 years. We are trying to do that, and I think I was very early on part of this struggle, so I've been involved for more than 20 years. I think in the struggle for digital accessible digital culture, empowering people and empowering community via a democratization of digital technologies, but also in particular to develop standards and platforms that allow a collective production of cultural knowledge to stay in the public domain, so to remain, a public good. And I must say that, one of the projects I remember, I think it was back in 2005, a long time ago, when I used to work with the former Minister of Culture, Gilberto Gil of Brazil, imagine, and we were collaborating in a big project that had to do also with the European Union, the European Commission. That was really at the beginning of social media. Imagine, there was nothing really up there that we could say it's user-generated. So there wasn't, we didn't have open publishing yet. We didn't have platforms where you could just upload your content, imagine, and I was also doing indie media a long time ago. So this all seemed, and the Brazilian government at that point wanted to do a massive investment into infrastructures to produce digital content from Brazilian people and become, let's say, digital sovereign, so to have digital sovereignty. So it seems to me this struggle is there since the very beginning of, let's say, the internet, I would say. But somehow we lost the war. I mean, it's very clear to reflect upon the fact that today the digital marketplaces are very, very concentrated, that we have a concentration of power that I think it's unprecedented in the era of industrial production. And so we have a few companies, a few big tech companies, mostly located in China and the US, that are able to really create extra profit from the general, let's say, collective production of content and data. So I think those are, I'm already putting forward some of the discussions we will maybe have later on about, I guess, possibly of the sustainability, of the production of public goods and digital public goods, digital public infrastructures, and how we are able to make digital public infrastructures mainstream. And I think here you have a fundamental and critical role in the city of Barcelona. The whole world is watching you, in a sense, because if a network of cities is able to say, this is our cultural policy, we create digital public infrastructures, we promote and foster through funding, through infrastructure, to regulation, the creation of digital public goods and digital public infrastructures, I guess we would be in a much better place. So this is a little bit what I tried to do when I was the comisionada de tecnología del Ayuntamiento de Barcelona. So that was a point also where we grew Decidim as a platform for citizen participation, and we created the first misura de governo on democratic digitization, where we put forward all these principles about digital rights for people, but also what this means when you are a public institution, where you are a government. So how do you provide open access culture, open access technology, free software and open source technology, interoperability, transparency, non-discriminatory use of data and algorithms, how we provide the right for participation and cultural participation of all people. And we charted those principles in actually ethical digital standards. That's how we called it at the beginning. And we even put it in an open source platform because we wanted other cities and other communities to participate and improve those principles. Those principles, so the city of Barcelona pioneered, let's say, this legislation. Then we created the digital standards. And then with that, the United Nations UN Habitat came to us and said, this is very interesting, why don't we make it a global movement? And so we created the Cities Coalition for Digital Rights, so you can see it now, and I think it's very similar somehow to what you are doing, but you are doing this more from the perspective of culture, that anyway I believe it's a general perspective, because I think culture should be everywhere in a sense. I mean, of course, we are producing culture, and we are enhancing our cultural capacity as human beings. So something maybe that I can add about what we've been doing at that level is we also put some of those standards and regulation in public procurement contracts. Maybe this is something you can think about it for the future on how to make those legislation real, concrete, when we fund cultural projects or when we fund infrastructure. And so we created, for example, data sovereignty standards in public procurement contracts, where we reclaimed, the data we collectively produce is our data. It's a public good. We are paying for it because we are paying for, for the services. We are paying taxes, and so we want to get the value back. So the question, I think, really there about data is how do we maximize the public value of data? And this, of course, relates to the question of how do we, completely, how do we make possible to have an economy that works and that's based on public value and public goods? And so just maybe to wrap it up, because I can talk, I think, a lot, but those are the key questions. And then also this ties to my role at the new European Bauhaus that we can discuss later, because I think the new European Bauhaus can be one of those programs where digital culture and digital public good can be very, very strong in it. But my statement here is it's very stupid today to limit and to create barriers to the circulation of knowledge today, right? And why this is very stupid? Because we have big challenges to solve. One, think about climate change and think about the climate emergency, think about making our cities greener, think about improving democracy. All those challenges, of course, we need collective intelligence of people, and of course we need to share knowledge as much as possible to achieve those big goals together. So the limitation of access to knowledge and the limitation to share knowledge impedes our capacities as communities, as citizens, as cities to be able to, create those new form of living. So yes, it is criminal today to impede access to knowledge and to impede transferring of knowledge in the maximum possible way. And I think so the answer how to do it, of course, is to fund education, to fund infrastructures, digital public infrastructures, and to pay well the people that are producing the content. And this is not a utopia. This should be part of the welfare state. Maybe I make a claim here, because I think, we know too well that the business model of digital platforms today is based on the manipulation and the monetization of personal information and data via advertising. Do I think this is a sustainable model for the creation of public goods in society? No. So the answer is no. Very simple. So we need an alternative? Yes.
Thank you so much, Francesca. Thank you. I really want to ask you questions now, but we'll leave it there and we'll let the other two speakers say something. But I will take an idea from this, and that is this clear, I wouldn't say accusation, but at least the awareness that there is a concentration of power and that access to content should be free. And this will lead on to the questions I want to ask afterwards about the balance between the capacity or the need to compensate the creators of content and open access.
Fieke, if you want to explain us a little bit what you do and what's your line of work. You have like 10 minutes.
I will also try to keep it short so we can have like more discussion and debate. And I have to say, I mean, +1 to most of the things you said. So, like Francesca, I also feel like I spent already too large part of my life in the digital world fighting sort of systemic sort of injustices within the digitalization of our society. I've worn many different hats, and I still wear many different hats. I've been a funder, practitioner, and academic, but always working on the intersection of technology and human rights. But it wasn't until I started my PhD on the police use of data and technology, and that I started working with anti-discrimination groups and also with people who were fighting police oppression, that I started realizing what was actually missing from the people I was working with and what was missing from the discussions around digital rights, around sort of algorithmic governance, things like this. And so when preparing for the panel, I realized there was another thing missing in the discussion, which are cultural rights, because at the moment they're non-existing in sort of the digital rights discussions and digital rights frames on a European or an international level. So that's already the end of my talk. But I think sort of when we talk also about cultural rights, and I saw the panel before about precarious workers, and there were so many relations to gig economy workers where there's also a lot of precarity in labor. But I feel like when we talk about technology, we're still in this sort of friction moment where we had this dream of what the internet could be, where it could offer sort of connections to millions of people, which it also did, but also amplify local struggles, share a wealth of knowledge with each other and collectively learn from it. And there are also really good examples from it. But what happened was that we created a neoliberal infrastructure that centers power and money in the hands of a few billionaires, and sort of the news of the last 2 weeks about Elon Musk buying Twitter just shows it like, it's like the business card or sort of like the picture perfect image of what the internet is at the moment. Where there's also sort of not just that power and money is centered in the hands of a few, but also that when we look at the majority of content, it's usually very normative, it's English, the majority is English. It's often very much like the standard, and there's very little room for plurality, or plurality doesn't get any attention. So because it's either it doesn't bubble up, or the algorithms push it down in the things. Then we're confronted with things like hate speech and trolling. Everybody who is not the standard gets subjected to all of sort of the horrors of the internet. But once we look beyond also these visible layers, we see that also those people who govern our internet infrastructures, it's a monoculture. I mean, if I look at the audience here, it's more diverse than when you go to the standards bodies who actually govern the internet. It's usually male, white, engineers, and these are the people who are creating the framework in which we all operate, in which also cultural rights get expressed. And this is especially like frustrating when you see that also art interventions have been monumentous in sort of exposing what the internet is today before people started becoming critical. So even though we know like the world we like to see is under pressure because of it, I still feel like when we So the last couple of years I've also been engaged in discussions within Brussels about the digitalization agenda and sort of agitating against the tech utopianist viewpoint that the European Commission has, in which they believe sort of that the digitalization of Europe sort of will create, it has a lot of political momentum behind it and also a lot of money behind it. And it is about, they see that this is the future of Europe because it's really for our economic well-being, but also they say social well-being. So it's the engine for economic growth, how they call it, and societal well-being. But actually when you start studying these papers, so it started with the white paper on AI, now we have the European AI Act, and we also have the Digital Services Act, which I know a little bit less about. You see how sort of on a European level they're actively mobilizing regulation, resources and the entire bureaucratic apparatus of Europe to sort of create a domestic infrastructure space because they are fearful that we lose the race against China and the US. So it's a very geopolitical issue. And then to not only like promote digital technologies, you see that they sort of want to safeguard some rights, but the rights that are being safeguarded are really fundamental rights, individual rights. So not to be discriminated against, privacy and procedural safeguards. These are also very important. But if you do an analysis of sort of the white paper on AI, but also the European AI Act, and also the critiques that have been offered to the draft, is that they totally miss the social, economic and cultural rights that we also have in Europe. Because it's all focused harms are only seen as individual harms. I cannot be discriminated against, but then again, we don't think about how this then impacts workers, whether it's cultural workers or gig economy workers, how it impacts our cultural rights. And when I was working with groups in the environment, I also Control-F'd the word environment in all of these digital rights policies of the European Commission. It doesn't exist. The same as cultural rights also is not a priority in it. I just try to check if it's there, and the words hardly are there. It refers to something that the Parliament suggested. So the culture is once mentioned in the European AI Act. And here they say sort of like, new technologies pose a threat to cultural rights, but they also pose a lot of opportunities. And then especially with culture and cultural workers, they go into the opportunities, how AI can save us, like, well, the things that they always say. That it will play an important role in preserving certain information, that sort of, it will increase visibility of the European cultural sector, all of these things. But this, I think, is lacking within the European debate, is that it always looks at the promise of technology and it never really looks at the actual technology or at the negative impacts these technologies can have on our broader social rights. And now I don't want to end up like on a negative note, because I do think there is hope. Like I do think alternative infrastructures are super important. Like here in the Barcelona area, you also have Gifinet, or you still have Gifinet, which is an alternative infrastructure. You have DCDeem. These are all things in which we can try to reclaim sort of infrastructure for the public good, and maybe also learn lessons to extrapolate towards that. But I feel like we need to do more, because when we see who's at the table of these discussions around the digitalization of Europe, and why I keep on mentioning this because it's super important, we have two main pillars in Europe at the moment, the Green New Deal and the digitalization agenda. And sort of within the digitalization agenda, the people who are often advocating for certain rights or included in it come from the digital rights community like me, where we come from a history of privacy, data protection, things like this. So the dominant framework we have are individual rights. And sort of we need to start crossing also movements where we bring together sort of where maybe we learn from each other, like what are cultural rights, so we can take this into our policy discussions, but also vice versa, like what are all the horrors at the moment of current regulation, and how does it impact people and artists and communities and our cultural heritage, because I think there's not enough cross-pollination. So I'll leave it at that for now.
Molt bé. Moltes gràcies. Ens has parlat de la tecnologia i els drets humans, i has apuntat molt correctament que...
And you've said that cultural rights, the rights of access to the culture, is not a fundamental right, and when you look for cultural rights, we still need to create a state of opinion, something that we can do very well through the network of cities, as Francesca said, because that state of opinion, we want to convert it into a fundamental right, which is what we're talking about at the end of the day here. With regard to diversity, we'll go back to that later. Now I would like to hear from Tony Navarro about the line he's working on and to introduce a little bit his point of view. I was going to give my talk in English, and with this change now talking about the importance of linguistic plurality and the preservation of cultural diversity. So I'm going to give my talk in Spanish rather than English because I feel much happier and I'm much more fluent in Spanish, talking about what Eva was saying with regard to the technology, starting basically with the feminist outlook of the 90s and all of the development previously with the current in feminism. What I'm going to do is to give a rather feminist outlook with regard to cultural rights in a digital environment, based on the fact that there is still a gender breach of discrimination against women, excluding the feminist outlook, and the feminist current in digital environment is basically this prima feminine, cyber feminism, which with the crisis of the dot-coms and things, even though that's an obsolete, anachronic debate, it is pertinent to contemporary digitization. The cyber feminism was a joining together of different theories and practices, joining together gender and digital culture that appeared in the 90s, I was saying, when the internet was still a space for the free exchange of information and communication, when they were still governed by the communities, above all in the forum. Prior to the bursting of the bubble of the dot-coms, there was policy in this describing the power on a social level and economy which favored innovation, global competitivity, or placed privilege on the mental rather than physical work. There was a whole series of promises made which was shared by the cyber culture of the 90s, and cyber feminism embraced it, and the question of gender and the participation of women. In the words of Cyril Plan, who is the main reference in the whole thing, he's written a book. He wrote a book about digital women and techno culture. The internet, the right of women, was developed and networked in which to write, work and play, giving fluidity to something that previously had been static, and multimedia offered a new touch environment in which women could find their space. I think all of this is very interesting because it summarizes basically one of the subjects, which was the question of cultural rights, which is freedom for the information of communication, the entity of the belonging of different multiple communities, and also the expression and the definition of the artist in general terms with regard to access and participation in cultural life. In terms of access to the information and communication, the internet has been used by women as a tool to communicate, to socialize, to chat, let's say, which is considered one of the worst of female sins. If we consider initiatives such as the movement for the women of the 90s, there are many spaces online where they can express solidarity and share knowledge and important know-how in questions such as digital self-defense, body independence and reproductive rights, and the rights of the trans people. Sandy Stone, who is an American academic in gender studies, said that on online spaces there is the possibility to find discussion groups, resources, and such simple things as knowing that there's somebody that you can talk to when you find yourself in an isolated state. This also leads us to the question of identity And it's very interesting because when we think of cultural identities, we think of large groups of people that share ethnic traits or religion, but no society has a single culture. There are always many. And also, I mean, there's always, you know, the prevailing culture and then many subcultures which could belong to minority or marginalized groups, and therefore each individual then could belong and form part to the development of different subcultures, different cultural communities, excuse me, each with their own emotional characteristic personalities, and making identity multiple and complex, which is something we see very strongly reinforced in digital environments, basically because of what I was saying, the question that virtuality provides an identity of fluidity in something that previously was unmovable. Static. This is, you know, I mean, if we believe that digital environments, and as I say, this is basically a text-based internet, eliminated the physical traits of communication, the accent, the appearance, and the color of skin, and made it a completely decontextualized communication. And so people were able to experiment with their identity. Which helped not as a space to affirm the female identity, but also as a space for free communication. With regard to this right to cultural rights, is defending not only the identification but the rights, and I'm quoting here from a report by the UN, where in addition to affirming self-identifying with diverse groups based on ethnicity, religion, and so on and so forth, the fundamental rights also included the right to change these reference identities throughout one's lifetime. So in third place, with regard to the question of artistic people, the internet allowed us to break away from the male dominance and gave way to many tendencies in net art or digital art where women stood as the main vanguard. And on doing this, it offered total access to cultural life, you know, moving from the margins and moving to a central position. So seeing this, it could appear that the effects of the internet were netly positive, not only in gender, but in many aspects with regard to, for example, education, as people were able to share free resources or on a very cheap basis. In terms of work, it allowed the woman to find work. With regard to cultural life, it permitted participation. But we must bear in mind that the feminist focus is not characterized by being particularly nuanced. It was highly criticized because of its excessive enthusiasm, techno-optimism, as Julie Backman said, and this enthusiasm was even, you know, less justified today when the promises of the internet seem to have faded a little, where we've seen all of the platformatization of the internet, and unfortunately something which is at the service of capital. So, for example, contrasting with this hospitality of internet to women today, there are several phenomena, such as the man or woman sphere, where there are spaces where misogynist men share humor, memes, and other things against the other half of humanity, such as for Chan, or other machistic digital fora, which mean that for women and other marginalized groups, be it for race or sexuality, meaning that the online experience is equivalent to receiving physical constant aggression. This comes as a consequence of the construction of the platforms, which are designed to capture data and attention, and thus focused on the creation of filter bubbles and things, leading to discrimination, and in the last instance, the politicization of all of this harassment and hate speech. In that sense, it's interesting that from certain projects in the civil society, such as Filmblog. We're trying to offer an alternative, a response, for example, providing helplines for victims of online digital harassment, gender violence, online gender violence, and other breaches of our rights, our digital rights and infrastructure. Then with regard to the question of the fluidity, or in reality, the appearance of different platforms has made the internet going to the opposite place that it was at the start of social media, leading to the constant reproduction of the ego, which responds to oppressive elements such as the oppression of gender, or the Eurocentric beauty channels thinking about all of the Instagram filters and things. I'm not going to dwell on that a lot. At all events, at the time, even though fluidity could have been possible, it doesn't guarantee a more egalitarian world, even though it may be possible to, look at the absence of physical traits in the communication, so we can't see the color of the skin or the kind of hair that the people we're dealing with has. There's a broad range of algorithmic discrimination which incorporate design and amplifying the inequality and racial hierarchies. And then with regard, I'm sorry, I'm extending a lot, so I'm going to move forward. The gentleman is speaking at a tremendous rate of knots. We're very sorry, but we're doing the best we can. But anyway, with regard to the feminist enthusiasm initial, many of the books that refer to cultural rights and digital environments say that the need has to be fulfilled of fulfilling the material rights. And for me, I think it's necessary to tackle other risks and the other challenges, but preserving this enthusiastic or positive energy that feminism had at the beginning, which contrasts pretty well with the current defeatist climate. How am I doing for time? Terrible. Okay. Just one thing that I want to say is that this exercise that we're doing of speaking different languages is fantastic and responds to the goal of these objectives, which is to speak of cultural diversity and digital rights, but we need to speak a little bit slower because we have interpreters who are translating, and I'm sorry, I feel so embarrassed. I was speaking at a terrible rate of knots. So, please do try and moderate your speed a little. I'm sure that, that they're doing very well with it because they're great professionals, but anyway. I'm sorry, we were struggling a bit. At all events, with regard to the most important, what I was saying, the most important thing is evaluation, which is very closely related to digitization or the creation of international networks of communication. We must consider that there is a threat to cultural diversity because it is a homogenizing force which, based on the exchange of people, goods, capital and knowledge, it really and truly operates as a unilateral process which imposes this market-centric Western outlook over other ways of understanding culture, community, and so on and so forth. Okay. Well, I'm seeing what I can skip. At the end of the day, this force of capitalism to deterritorialize traditions and old norms, even though the capitalization, what it loses on one side, it wins on the other, and it ends up by imposing other rather rigid norms which are in line with the accumulation of capital to obtain profit. And this is what governs the internet. And here I'm going to focus more on the question of the material infrastructure on which the internet is based. It belongs to corporations which pursue their own private profit, and even public services which are oriented to the common good, as Francesca mentioned. Now, if everybody has access to internet, which is necessary unless we breach the right to participate in cultural environments, and also it would be contrary to the right to enjoy the benefits of scientific process and its application, including digital culture and technological development. Okay, you've got to wind up. I'm sorry. I think maybe, could I leave it there? Okay, well, thank you very much. You started talking about cyber feminism, about identity fluidity, about techno-optimism, which is a great concept, and we've ended up talking about algorithmic discrimination and the great powers of the internet that Francesca and Fike mentioned. So, now I'm going to go to the first of the questions that I wanted to ask you. We've all spoken about the need to have this knowledge. I mean, Francesc.
Estem parlant de temes que són molt importants per la societat, que es debat a l'internet i hem de poder tenir aquests continguts.
How do you believe, and we'll start with the three of you, we'll start with Francesca in the same order as up to now. How do you believe that this open access, this excess of content, access to content that we citizens are demanding is offset with fair compensation or the ability of the creators of content to have their work remunerated? It's a great debate. I mean, you can't answer it in 5 minutes, but let's try.
Okay. Yeah, no, this is a very important question. I think maybe two things I would say before I answer to the question. I think the first one is I think we have to absolutely not limit our imagination to keep talking about the internet. I would actually maybe even ask to stop talking about the internet if possible, because this is not our aim really when we produce culture. I mean, the internet, it is a particular set of standards that gave rise to a particular type of infrastructure, and I think we should open up our imagination in terms of what we need for the future. And in fact, I think your last question is, to me, the most relevant in terms of what we are supposed to do, which is how do we make sure that when we are digitizing the infrastructures of libraries, of museums, of cultural centers, and cultural institutions, we know what we are doing. Yes? And I'm not sure we know what we are doing when we are digitizing public goods, and I think we don't have a clear strategy. So I think this is, for me, like one of the most important issues, because as we know, digitizing, for example, paintings, or digitizing, cultural production of all kinds, it creates another form of legitimacy and power for different forms of intermediaries that quickly can come into the picture. And obviously, I'm talking about the big technology giants that, as you know, they have already big programs of digitizing culture and the arts. And for them, it is very easy today, as it stands, to go to public institutions and to say, we are doing this for free, you don't have the capacity to do it, we are giving you everything for free, please give us everything you have, we digitize it, we put it on our platform. I mean, this is happening in the most numbers of museums in Europe, and I think we should have a very clear strategies about what we do in alternative, and of course this alternative should be into put investment, massive, large-scale investment into the museums, the libraries, and the public institutions to be able to do it with European standards, with open source and open access technologies, preserving our fundamental rights, and do it in a way that in the future, when you will have digital and physical access to cultural production, we will be, as people, as citizens, the ones that are profiting from it. So it's also about redistributing economic value. Because we know, it's digitizing museums. In the future, they will be running the museums. And when we give them access to the material, are we formulating well the intellectual property agreement that we have with these companies? Who is owning those goods? Of course they are cultural heritage, but are we also translating the cultural heritage into the intellectual property rights when we do these agreements with, with the tech companies or with the providers? And are we, for example, maybe trading NFTs in exchange of a nice exhibition without really knowing what we do? I mean, I've seen many times, you know, public authorities that say, well, let's just create a kind of 3D augmented reality exhibition. Let's do an NFT of a kind of a cultural heritage, without thinking about the frameworks, the strategy, the intellectual property, who is managing it, and how do we make sure it stays in the public domain.
Exactly.
So for me, those are the questions, really, when we're talking about what does it mean, you know, our cultural heritage in the digital society. And I think that is where I connect with what was said before about the huge opportunity we have today in Europe, because Europe has set, you know, the two priorities, digital transformation and the green transition, and we are putting billions and billions of euros, I think I calculated around 400 billion investments in digitizing Europe, and I think culture should be very, very, very prominent there. And I don't know if you have done it with the Next Generation EU in Spain, but I think, you know, maybe there is not more time to do it there, but I think this is very important, because are we creating the capacity, the capabilities for museums, public institutions, cultural places, you know, public spaces to do this? Or are we just outsourcing our knowledge to the tech companies for free in exchange of our data and in exchange of our intellectual property, and so in exchange of our cultural heritage? For me, this is the big question. And just to come to your, so obviously I've also answered to your initial question, which is, as I said before, it doesn't make any sense to limit the circulation of knowledge in this time. You know, we have to push, we have to struggle, we have to fight for the circulation of knowledge, for the creation of infrastructures that allow knowledge to be circulated and openly accessed, in particular academic and scientific knowledge, in particular, and I say it twice because it's absolutely critical to have access to scientific knowledge, as we have seen during the COVID-19, where having access to the vaccine as a fundamental human right, and you know, the European companies didn't want to waive the intellectual property on vaccine, and I think that the European Union and our member states had to oblige the waiver on, you know, royalties and IPs over vaccine, which is a global public good, in particular for global South countries. So I think those are the questions, right? And I think, you know, we have seen practices of people distributing academic knowledge all the time put in jail or treated as criminals. This is absolutely not, shouldn't be tolerated. We should be fighting for a framework at the very core of the European public policies where those values are straight there. And I think then, finally, and I close, of course, you discussed it before, precarization, precarity, and people have to be paid well. I think this is a general question of rights and labor rights and in digital work. What is today digital work? A lot of things. A lot of things are becoming digital works because they are mediated by platforms. They are mediated by digital tools. So I think also the conversation should be broader. You are not talking only about artists here. We are going to be talking about a lot of labor which is going to be digitized. So digital labor becomes many things. So we're talking about, you know, labor rights in general, and this is maybe a conversation for another time. But then coming to your point, massive investment in education, skills, and infrastructure, for me, that's the answer to your question, because if we don't have those infrastructures, this content, this data is going to end up in the big tech platforms. We have no choice. So, I mean, so what are we going to do? And the public institutions are the ones that have to step up, create capacity, create knowledge, create competence, skills, and have the right infrastructures to be preserving the common heritage as a public good. And just I end here, there is even a communique from the French government during the French presidency, which is creating a task force to protect digital commons in Europe and digital public good in Europe. We have to use those things and say, this is the official government policy, so we have to obey to those policies, and you have to do it. And by the way, I sit in the board of the public television, Italian public television, right? Public television has a big role here. They also have to do their parts, the digital platforms that their companies, the public broadcasting, public service broadcasting are rolling out, they have to be made with these standards. And they have to have collaboration with universities, with public media broadcast, with academia and cultural institutions. That's how I see it, because if it remains something for the activists, sorry, but we are not gonna win any of this.
Totalment d'acord. Hi ha una corrent internacional ara en l'acadèmia parlant dels...
We need to talk about compulsory licenses, you know, the compulsory licenses for academic content. This is a discussion that would take some time, but it's something that is vindicated a lot from the Anglo-Saxon world. Compulsory licenses are much more related to collective groups, but the debate has been created, and from the world of academia, they are defending the rights of citizens to gain access to this knowledge that has been created with public funds, with public resources.
So, Fike, if you remember the question.
I sort of remember the question. So it's about
So it's a fair compensation and open access. How do you balance both things? L'accés i la compensació dels creadors de continguts.
Yeah, I have to say I was also struggling with this question between fair compensation and open access, because I agree that knowledge should flow freely. And maybe it's more a question at the moment about visibility and dependencies. So I'll talk about this. But if we look, the universities were mentioned, but also cultural institutions were mentioned by Francesca. If we look at sort of the dependencies that are currently existing, there are so many layers where if you look at the universities in the Netherlands and the UK, they're all running on Microsoft clouds. They used to be all Linux-based, open source, all the principles we sort of agree on, and they all went to the Microsoft license because it's easier to manage from a distance for a large-scale group, or this is what they think. It's different on the budget, so so for the university it's easier. If we look at sort of Google Scholar, a lot of sort of academic knowledge is actually based behind paywalls, which is strange to begin with because it's paid by public money, and then public money has to pay to open license it as well. So it's like we're paying for it twice, and the question is who profits actually from this? And then we have this in academia, this thing what everybody uses, which is Google Scholar, and basically it indexes a lot of knowledge that is out there. But the question, of course, is why is Google the organization doing this? And what does it actually mean when they start ranking what knowledge is superior over other knowledge? Because are they the determining factor, or should that actually be done in a different way? And I think a lot of lessons from sort of these places where they already gone through a lot of digital transformation and lost many battles, or many of the values and the principles I think some of us on stage here hold dear, we can learn from this as well in the digital transition of cultural institutions. Because it's a really valid question, like how do we want to digitize this content? Because also when we look at cultural sites, they're not just, if you look at a museum, it's not just looking at a pretty painting, but usually they have a lot of other things, educational purposes, to show diversity and plurality, maybe to show also things that are not comfortable for us at the moment in society, and to really push sort of the debates. What if we outsource the digital version of this into the hands of for-profit companies that sort of standardize and only produce the hegemony, where then is opportunity for space, for dialogue, for culture and creation. And once we've given it, it's really difficult to get it back. And so I really like this call, sort of, if there's two pillars in the European policy, where we have green and we have sort of the digitalization agenda of Europe with a lot of money behind it, we need to reclaim part of that budget also for what does it mean to digitize cultural institutions, and how can we do it in an open and sort of alternative fashion than is currently happening. Because at the moment, most of this money is going to either developing new technology or to the military-industrial complex, and we're all paying for it. And sort of part of this money should go actually to find strategies in which we actually center people and planet and cultural rights and social rights over those of the market, industry and security. And at the moment, the funding spent is totally skewed. And I've tried to engage with different discussions about how can we reprioritize this funding, and it doesn't matter what year I start this conversation with people in Brussels, they always say we're too late. So anyway, we're too late, but let's start the conversation. Doesn't mean, matter what term of the Commission we start this conversation, we're always too late. But I do think we should start investing this type of money in creating a collective strategy and learning already from the failures that have existed within the digitization of Europe. So we had this massive cloud project, I forgot what it was called, but, sorry? No, yeah, so there was like, there was the understanding that the clouds were dominated by American providers, so we had to, Gaia X, yeah, we had to have European cloud providers. It's still going on, because once it's in the budget line, it's very difficult to get it out. But what started from good values totally got co-opted by the market logic that is driving Europe at the moment, but also by the bureaucracy that doesn't intrinsically hold these values. And I think here, cultural institutions and especially public institutions play a role, because the people or the activists who are fighting to include sort of openness into sort of these projects, they don't have the longevity to stay with projects like Gaia X, the European cloud, for 10, 15 years. They're being dragged left, right and center because then a new bill comes up, there's other things that draws their attention, because they don't have the same stamina as the European Commission in this case has. And I think here public institutions, cultural institutions can play a really critical role to follow up and sort of keep on inserting these values and demand that we reprioritize resources to create a digitization agenda that we all agree with. So I would actually say sort of maybe what is the role of cultural institutions also to break these dependencies and break these market logics that they're currently capturing the digital imaginary of Europe.
Yeah,
In Amsterdam, for instance, the Rijksmuseum digitized all the collection. All of it is available online, doing a very assertive action, right? Almost trying to find that right holder to see what the consequences can be, and if this could be elevated to other legal instances so that we can start having case law interpreting this. And in the beginning, the aim was to strike a balance between the profit given by the creator to society, that is all intellectual property rights, and that is a balance between that and the business model, the creator, and also providing legal certainty so that society can benefit from these creations and the creator will continue to create. So this balance with good intentions by intellectual property laws is completely skewed, and it collapses because in the end, who goes to Brussels and exerts pressure? Only interest groups, that is the cultural industry, right? And what we are discussing here is not defended well.
Yeah, just go ahead if you can be very brief.
No, very brief. I think we also shouldn't fall into the contraposition only between, you know, the industry versus the people kind of thing. I mean, I don't really like it. I think a lot of the cultural industry today is also in crisis. I mean, cultural industry meaning good cultural production, independent cultural production. And I think actually one of the objectives of those kind of public digital infrastructures should be to support independent and good quality production of culture and knowledge, which today it's, you know, this is the paradox of the digital world, where, you know, we have massive amount of knowledge that is produced and the good quality journalism, the good quality knowledge production, the good quality even algorithms that help you find good quality information is more and more difficult to produce. So I think the cultural production, the real independent cultural production, that's what we should be funding. And I think that's in the cultural industry, of course, and and they can also be for profit. I mean, we shouldn't be afraid, to shape the market. That's what I'm saying. And I think, we are saying on one side, of course, we need digital public infrastructures and a strong role of public cultural institutions, but we also need a strong and dynamic market of quality content, quality cultural production. And in order to do that, I mean, actually the big tech make that almost impossible, because it's, look at cinema. Look at the crisis in cinema. Look at the crisis of independent journalism. Look at the crisis of independent magazines. They all have problems, and they all want to find new avenues for distributing knowledge and accessing, audience. So I think this is. I just wanted to make sure we don't end into the contraposition, the people, the good guys versus, the bad market. I think we are in a kind of joint struggle here, and I think we can find a way to benefit, preserving the public interest and the public good, but also allowing for a better cultural production to actually happen. Yeah. This is a great question, in fact. I mean, we can maybe talk later about that. Good quality, what is good quality? Cultural production, what is good quality? Definitely we know, however, we can say some of us that study the digital marketplaces, we know how, a specific form of recommendation algorithms, polarization due to how we use the media, make ranking and the ranking of knowledge that she was talking about before, or even, how do we consume knowledge in the digital platforms, being very skewed towards what audience want to see. And sometimes this is absolutely not.
Okay. Maybe we can get the microphone down so we can all hear you well, and also. No, I think we'll take one question from the audience, and then we'll go to Tony, and then we'll open the questions to the audience. If that's
sorry,
okay.
I don't want to cut anyone else from asking questions.
Well, just one question, then Tony, and then the audience again.
We have an entire part of the population, especially young people, that direct their cultural expressions towards these mainstream medias, and it's always a contract with the devil, because you have to pay a price. You have to pay a price which is either money or violence, or being subjected to algorithm, everything that you've said, and it's absolutely clear, and I absolutely agree. But you either have this, or you have nothing, because when you say the cultural institutions should be part of the discussion, but cultural institutions don't recognize these people. They had to go to YouTube to make their videos because they are not welcome in museums, in theaters, in what is usually funded. That's why jazz music took 40 years to be recognized. That's why rock music took 30 years to be recognized. That's why now electro music is not recognized. That's why hip-hop is still, and that's why video games are not still recognized, or it's just the start of it. And we always have to wait 30 years. So it's either the market or nothing at all.
I think though, I mean, what you're saying is true. I think at the same time, it is true that certain things that are very innovative in theater, in the arts, in dance, in culture, we are seeing it because we see long-term funding of public institution for creative people, for the cultural industry. Yes, I mean, this is true. I can also say that, I mean, cinema production at this point, yes, it's true. There is Netflix, there is Amazon, there is the new players, but still, if you take away the public funding, you will see almost nothing happening. So I think it's both ways, and in fact, we are almost advocating also for innovation and cultural opening in the public institution. That's maybe something we have to say. Why do we need innovation to happen either in the niches, in the activist, in the niche, or at the very core of the business model of platforms, which at the end, they don't have the incentive to continue to support cultural heritage. Because, you know, they're going to make profit. If it doesn't work, they're going to close. So they're not going to produce, they're not going to support the cultural production for society. So I think it's a very valid question. How do we innovate in the mindset and in the programs of public institutions in order to be there to do that?
Okay, so
Now, Tony, if you'd like to answer that question. I don't know whether I'll be able to contribute with anything new that has not been said so far, but anyway. I'm going to make a mess between English and Catalan. Anyway, I think we clearly see the tension between intellectual property rights and the right to access to culture and scientific knowledge. Nevertheless, people tend to say that in order to guarantee this fair remuneration for the benefit of the interests of the authors, when in actual fact this is not true. The justification of the right that the defense of intellectual property is based in the face of the other that is breached or is attacked is not even given, because intellectual property systems benefit large companies and their economic interests, and not the authors or individual creators. In the case of academic papers, it is clearly seen. Payment publications do not have a direct benefit on the authors or researchers that publish, but it benefits only the editors, the publishing houses. And nonetheless, open access does not entail an adverse effect, since it does allow for access to knowledge that favors what is meant to be the goal of the law on intellectual property, patents, and copyright. On paper, they are sought to promote investment in those sectors where there could be certain fear for making publications. But with this last question, after reading reports on especially how culture is defined, which in philosophy is a very interesting matter, what does culture mean, you know, this thing? And in most cases, when culture and cultural rights are mentioned, even if they do not provide a consensus with the definition, they say that in relation to remuneration in the cultural industry, creators and authors, when in actual fact the way that cultural rights are presented, since they include anything of human activity, and cultural diversity is not intrinsically good, but we need to assess it in relation to whether they favor or go against human rights. Anyway, I'll just leave it there because your comments are clear. Now we open up the floor. Do you have any questions or comments in relation to the topics we just discussed? No? Okay. So we'll move on to the next question, which is, what can we do to implement policies, and this is very much related to what we have been discussing to now, that promote this diversity? So we're talking about this desideratum, I'm referring to the implementation. That is, those projects that do not have a business model, that we know that there is a will to make them available to the public. I'm referring to more innovative pilot projects, more alternative projects, projects that are out, as you mentioned at the beginning, of the stereotypes. How can we promote all of these projects to ensure they have their place on the internet on an equal footing to mainstream projects?
I just also want to just a quick comment on what was said in the room. I think he's totally right. I mean, the remix culture is something that was also is still great on the internet, and it really allows sort of not dominant culture to express themselves. So the hip-hop culture is a really good example, but you have different forms of remixing now that young kids are using and that are not recognized. And cultural institutions are gatekeepers, just like how Google and Facebook and all of these other platforms are also gatekeepers. They're just they're just a different kind of gatekeeper, and maybe their power and scope is a little bit larger than someone there. But how do we foster diversity? I mean, like any diversity or plurality, you have to fight for it. It doesn't come easy. Like every struggle that is not the dominant narrative or the dominant type of culture is that you have to fight for it. And I think here, where maybe what I would advocate for is that we try to find sort of linkages between people who are fighting for it, because it's not just on the visible layer. Like when people say, "Oh, it's great. There's so much ways to express ourselves on the internet and be whatever sexual orientation you are, or feminist stories." I always have to think about how a lot of the things we see on the internet are skin deep. So there was this amazing story about, well, not amazing, but how Facebook, after a lot of sort of lobbying, changed sort of the gender you could choose to sort of male, female, and binary or other. There were different ways to put it. But once I started looking at the patents and how their algorithms actually worked and how people were sold to advertisers, it was a binary again. It was male, female. So as soon as you look under the hood, you see that a lot of sort of these diversity things that are really skin deep in a lot of these platforms. And so to actively fight it, that it also starts trickling down into the deeper layers, whether that's sort of the market economy behind it, or whether it's the infrastructural debates, or the money debates, or the policy behind it. It requires a lot of effort, and that cannot be on the shoulders of just like a small group of people who are currently fighting for more diversity and inclusion online, because they're also a very homogeneous group. So we will never have plurality if they're the only ones who are at the seat of the table with policy people.
Could you respond very briefly, and then we'll have one specific question with a very quick answer, because we've only got 5 minutes left. I think that the answer is very similar to what we've heard before, so I won't answer now, I'll answer later. So, what scenario for the internet do you see? Well, sorry, very briefly. Now, with all of the debate on the long term and things, I was thinking, okay, but yeah, I'm sorry. Without an internet apocalypse, then, in the best case scenario, what do you see? Well, I'm a kind of biographic repository. I think that could be very interesting. One of the options is a platform socialism, where as opposing platform capitalism, it's proposing a social democratic outlook on these platforms, public services, common services that we should call for. And also another option is Internet for the People 2050, and it's a book which takes you through the history of how the Internet was an academic military project. It went through a process of privatization, and then we would need to deprivatize it, and it proposes an interesting strategy. So I think that's a great slogan, Internet for the People. Let's remember, we're talking about cultural rights. So what the best case scenario for you? I think the best case scenario is to stop talking about the Internet and we open up our imaginations. I think that one of the problems is that our thinking...
That the only thing we can do is basically to pray, at this point, these oligopolies and these, lords like, the Tesla guy or the others, big owners of this platform, to please apply the rules that we set as democratic governance. And I think this is not going to work anymore. I mean, and this is happening as we speak. The metaverse doesn't exist. I mean, in fact, it does not exist. And the shopping mall idea of this new virtual reality of Mark Zuckerberg doesn't exist, so we shouldn't talk about it. The Twitter is basically now in crisis as we speak. People are leaving, people getting fired by Twitter. So we have actually an apocalypse happening here. And I think those conversations are important because let's find out how do we foster, what kind of infrastructures we need, how do we have to pull massive investment there, and what kind of knowledge and skills we have to create. Yes, and I think those are the real questions in order to produce good quality knowledge, good quality information, and the type of infrastructures we need to do that. And we will see that it doesn't make sense, to continue to engage in these platforms. I mean, we do have, actually urgency of alternative platforms, but maybe, for example, data and artificial intelligence, they should be global goods. We do not need to replicate, we don't need competition at the level of data and artificial intelligence. We need competition maybe at the level of the cultural services they are produced. I mean, it's a big question you made, but let's do a provocation. Let's stop talking about things that don't work. They don't exist.
A resounding response. That would lead to a whole other debate. Let's leave it there. But Fike, I'd like to hear your opinion very, very briefly, please, because we're out of time. But the best case scenario for the Internet 2050, what would you say?
I think the best case scenario for the internet, but also for digital rights.
In digital rights,
Yeah.
exactly. In
But,
the digital rights
and for
framework.
cultural rights, is to tax the rich, because we have never taxed these companies. They've only grown so big because we don't tax them.
Good point. Good point.
But then we can reinvest these resources into actual public goods.
Yeah. Moltíssimes gràcies a tots tres.
Thank you very much to the three of you and to our audience for being here late on a Friday afternoon listening to you here. Speak has been a true pleasure, and I hope to see you again in other fora and other debates, because there are very important subjects that have emerged here and which we need to continue discussing. Thank you.
Yeah, it's very good.